Jesus had been invited as the guest of honour at this meal, but the Pharisees seemed to have another hidden agenda that wasn't so hidden. Jesus knew their intent. Luke records the incident of the man with dropsy being healed, and then two examples Jesus gives of generosity and servanthood. The Pharisees were the religious group that ruled over the temple and worship at the time of Jesus. They made sure all the Old Testament laws were obeyed. If you were caught not obeying them, it was the Pharisees who would ban you from worship until you'd performed the rituals needed to show repentance. They were given some freedom to prosecute people by the Roman occupiers, as were all of the distant districts that the Romans occupied. However, as seen with Jesus, the Pharisees didn't have the right to crucify people. Jesus finds himself being tested by the presence of an ill man. He had to decide whether it was work to heal him on the Sabbath, as work was forbidden by law. However, it was believed that only God could heal. So if the man was healed, the Pharisees could hardly accuse Jesus of working. Rather, they'd be accusing God of breaking the Sabbath. If only God could perform the healing. Jesus then used the examples of a boy on an ox in distress to show how the healing was not breaking at least the spirit of the law. This small incident was one of many where the Pharisees demonstrated that they were only interested in their own agenda. So Jesus uses examples from the banquet itself to illustrate that putting oneself last and acting in generosity is better than acting in self-interest. He speaks of the guest, presuming he or she was of such importance that they should be at the head of the table. The guest was puffing themselves up. The guest is then embarrassed in front of all the other guests. Jesus tells those listening that instead each guest should take on an air of humbleness and then have the chance to be exalted by the host. He goes on to talk about not inviting people to your house who will reciprocate, but those who are less fortunate. Then you'll be rewarded by God rather than those you invited. Jesus goes on after this to tell the story of a rich man who invited all of his friends and relatives to a feast. When they made themselves unavailable, he sent his servants to invite all they could find: the poor, lame, crippled and blind. In this parable, Jesus is actually describing what heaven will be like, where those who believe they don't need God will decline the invitation to dine with the host, while those who see their own desperation are glad to accept the invitation. In his commentary on Luke, Craig A. Evans points out that the net effect of this section is to proclaim loudly and clearly that those least expected to share in the blessings of the kingdom of God will in fact share in them, while in contrast, and surprisingly, those most expected to be participants may very well be among those who will be excluded. This teaching would sound really strange to the Pharisees, as they assumed those who are unfortunate in their eyes, for example, the lame, blind, poor, crippled, etc., were that way as they were cursed by God. To say that they were equal to the Pharisees and their rich friends and relatives in God's eyes was a foreign concept for them. Leonard Bernstein, one of America's great composers and conductors, was asked, what was the hardest instrument to play? He replied without hesitation, second fiddle. Jesus spoke of his followers being salt and light. He explained that we all need to be light. That is, we need to stand up and out as Christians. We need to be noticed and noticeable because of the lives we lead. we are also salt. Salt was sprinkled on food to keep it from rotting before refrigeration was available. Jesus' followers are sprinkled all around the world in order to be witnesses for Jesus all around the world. I remember when I was at Bible college, there was a young man who told me he couldn't wait until he graduated so he could serve God. At that time, I was treasurer of the church I attended, had 4 children in school, taught RE at the local primary school, and was involved in the community. I said to him, surely you can find some way to serve God now. Benjamin Whichcote said, none are so empty as those who are full of themselves. It seems that the young man was too proud to minister to those who were around him. He believed the only work worthy of him was missionary work overseas. One wonders what opportunities he missed. However, Jesus has placed each of us here in Melbourne now to serve God. God has created us all uniquely with our own gifts, talents, strengths and weaknesses. Then God will give each of us a role to play according to how we've been created. We should not be too proud or envious of others as their roles, to not embrace the role Jesus has given us in serving him. When we think of our fathers today, being Father's Day, many of us can see how our own fathers served us. Traditionally, fathers have served their families by providing for them. As economics have changed, so has the role of the father. More so now, mothers are working as well, and so fathers have had to become accustomed to helping around the house as well. Paul asked fathers not to embitter their children so that they wouldn't be discouraged. Fathers do play a vital role in the emotional development of their children. Those of us who have had difficult relationships with our fathers can attest to that as much as those who have had healthy relationships with their fathers. David Gottesberg says, fathers, like mothers, are not born. Men grow into fathers, and fathering is a very important stage in development. Most importantly, we need to remember that God is the source of love. And if we feel we haven't received the love we should have from either of our parents, God can fill that void. Of course, Jesus taught that he came to serve and not be served, and all those who follow him are expected to have the same attitude. Jesus illustrated this teaching by washing the feet of his own disciples, those who gave their lives to follow him, by showing them that he was willing to be their servant, not just their master. Jesus was giving his disciples a life lesson on how they should think and act. We are to follow Jesus' example and be servants. That's our calling as Christians.